My name is Howard Lewis Shipp. I'm going to be talking about an interesting open source project called Twitter Bootstrap. First question though is, how many people here feel they're like a dual threat? I can code and I can design. Raise your hand. Okay, a couple of hands come up, but I can guarantee my hand isn't one of them. And I think most people are in the same boat. We're building more and more interesting applications now on the web. They're running more and more right in the browser, which is great. But we still have the few basic challenges that you have anytime you're building an app. Make it work, make it right. Nowadays, a big part that we didn't used to have, make it pretty. And then, of course, make it work in Internet Explorer. Okay? A cheap shot, but I do spend an awful lot of time firing up a virtual machine on my Mac so I can see what things look like in IE, and then panic. Bootstrap is all about solving these problems. It is about making things pretty and making them look right even under Internet Explorer. And when you combine the JavaScript that comes with Bootstrap with jQuery, now you have something that interacts right, that has a good interaction with the user, and again, even on Internet Explorer. Now I'm going to be doing a bunch of examples, and caution here, I'm using CoffeeScript, the fun little noob script that humanizes JavaScript a little bit. Now if you've seen CoffeeScript before, you'll probably be happy. If you haven't, it's not that complicated. It's just a little language that compiles into CoffeeScript. As I've heard someone say, it just makes you a better JavaScript programmer. But it's a concise and readable variation of JavaScript. Optional parentheses, implicit returns, concise function definitions. Yeah, you're able to express a lot more quickly, which is great. It fits on slides better. Later on, we're going to be uploading or making available the slide deck, and I have an expanded HTML and JavaScript slides that won't be in this presentation, but they will be in the distributed slide deck. So if you want to see the HTML, you'll be able to see that. Now the thing with CoffeeScript, invoking functions looks kind of like normal JavaScript, but you can omit a lot of the parentheses where they're not needed, and it's very smart about knowing what is a parameter and what's an object definition. But defining functions, something you do a lot in JavaScript in terms of all your event handlers and so forth, those are really nice. Those are just a dash greater than sign. And with the implicit returns, things end up being very, very tight. Okay, so we're going to have CoffeeScript in the examples, but for the most part, the core of what you see in CoffeeScript is just like you'd write with JavaScript. You just write less stuff around it. And if you're interested, we do have good wireless here. The CoffeeScript homepage has a tab where you can put in CoffeeScript and see exactly what JavaScript you get out. Okay, enough of that. Here's my friend Molly. Molly, I'm in Portland, Oregon. My friend Molly runs a bunch of pub quizzes in Portland. And they're a lot of fun, but there's a lot of paperwork involved with them. Everyone has to fill out their answers, and we pass the sheets around, and everyone does sort of a group grading, and then they have to be passed back to Molly so that she can score all the teams and tell everybody where they are. And it slows things down, which isn't so bad. That's where they sell a lot of beer and pizza. But still, we've been thinking, hey, wouldn't it be neat if we could bring this online and have an online experience for these pub quizzes where people could take the quizzes on their iPhones or Android phones? So I start banging out an app for this. And this is kind of what an app for me looks like, tables and, alert panels. Yeah, pretty ugly. I'm not a designer. With Bootstrap, the same app dressed up with some of the Bootstrap styles, just the standard out of the box, starts looking a lot better. And some of the interactions you get in terms of the modal dialogue support and other things look very nice and sharp. So that's what it's all about. It's basically saying, instead of having a baseline that is plain, ugly, undecorated HTML, have something that looks pretty sharp and looks pretty much the same across browsers and platforms. Okay, so here's the project on GitHub. So current version 2.1, it's real easy to download. It's just a zip file, easy to integrate into your existing application. As they say, it's built by and for nerds. So it's basically at Twitter, there's a designer and an engineer, and they work together to keep this up to date. It came out of a desire from Twitter to have their many different pages and applications they expose have a consistent look and feel, both the public-facing ones that we see and the internal applications that run inside Twitter. And it's set up so that you can get the consistent look and feel even onto smartphones, even onto your iPad. And a major part of it are some custom jQuery plugins that provide a lot of the functionality. And as we'll see, in many cases, you just have to have the jQuery plugins available, and it picks up the behaviors sort of passively. Better yet, it's all very customizable. Internally, it uses a tool called Less, which is a JavaScript CSS macro language, so that it can be easily customized. And they have a customized tool I'll show at the end. So there's a default look to Bootstrap, but that doesn't have to be the only look for Bootstrap. It's a very popular project. I took this snapshot a couple of days ago, and we can see that Bootstrap is one of the most, or is the most popular starred project on GitHub. If you notice, you go down from that, you go down from there to Node or to jQuery or to Rails. That's an awful lot of people who are working on it, and there's an awful lot of patches and activity on the project. That's kind of a good thing to have. Your minimal setup for Bootstrap is to make it an HTML5 document, so you're using the HTML5 doc type tag, and to include the CSS and the JavaScript. And this slide is kind of silly because it doesn't show that jQuery needs to be there too. So I need to correct that. And with that amount, a lot of your basic features of Bootstrap are in place. One of the main aspects of Bootstrap that I really like is the idea of the grid. It divides the page up into 12 little sections. And then it's very easy to create rows, tables, forms, and other things where all the elements line up onto this grid. The default grid is 940 pixels wide. I guess that sort of fits with a modern browser that's 1024 pixels wide with a little border on the side. And what you have is when you're laying out your page, there's a special CSS class called row that triggers some of this layout behavior. And then nested divs inside that can have span tags, span names. So the class name of span 2, span 3, span 4, all the way up to span 12 says how wide you want it to be. And I'm sort of running a live demo. This is not, let me see if I can make that a little bigger. I can, but not without making, nope. Okay, we'll make it normal size. So this is what it looks like running. I'm sorry it's a little bit small. And the neat thing again is that that you don't get bogged down in saying this particular one-off element is 50 pixels wide and doing it with an inline style or having a one-off entry in your style sheet for this. You have this very consistent way of saying how big things should be relative to each other and how they should be laid out. And these tags combine. So sometimes you're saying that something has a certain span. If you want it indented relative to other things, there's this offset. Same thing, you have offset 1 all the way up to offset 11. That says how far relative to the previous element on that row you want to make it. Now, a lot of the examples I'm going to show, just like I mentioned CoffeeScript, I'm going to be using Jade, which is a standard JavaScript templating language. We're seeing this show up. It was in Ruby, it was called Haml. In the Java Scala world, it's called Scalate. I may not be pronouncing that right. And this, again, is a way of expressing the structure of your markup in a more minimal way, but like CoffeeScript, indentation is important to it. So here we're saying a div that's sort of assumed with the CSS class name container. And then within that, a div with the class name row, and within that, 3 divs with different values for span. Okay. Sometimes you have an element on the grid that you want to subdivide again. And you can nest rows within other rows. And when you do that, you have the span width of the elements nested inside match the immediate container. So here we have a span 8 element. Within it is a row within that that spans 4. So 2 span 4 elements add up to a span 8. And if we zoom down here, we can see how that looks. So I'll go to the second example. Okay. So here's our div with a span 8, crosses all the way over to here. And then nested within that is a div with span 4 and another div with span 4. So this stuff is very nice because it means that your app is more consistently laid out. There's also an option for a fluid layout. So the standard grid is fixed at that 960 pixels. And if you shrink your window too small, it gets clipped. But by adding dash fluid to your rows, it says, okay, this row is 100% of the available width. Let's subdivide it from that. And so with that, we can, in fact, shrink the window down. Hello? Sorry, it's a little crowded here to not have a mouse. Okay, so here the cells within this grid scale up and down based on the actual width rather than clipping the way they would with the fixed grid. So that's, again, good if you're having the same content show up on multiple different devices. And this is the general Bootstrap approach. Just by having the Bootstrap CSS there, you get a CSS reset, meaning that everything else being equal, you get pretty much the same look and feel across platforms, across browsers. Then you're adding a little bit of semantic layout. This div is a row. You know, this row is nested inside that row. There's a container for the whole thing. And by adding more and more of these simply named, logically named CSS classes to your elements, you start getting more and more of your behavior, more and more of your layout. Many elements, almost all the elements, honor that span CSS class name. So here's an example of a table, and I'm saying it's span 12. It's taking up all the width it can. And I'm creating a T head in my table. Now, generally when we do tables and pages, we kind of skip the difference between the head and the body, but Bootstrap sort of keys off of that to give the head rows a much different rendering than the body rows. And this is a little bit of stuff to provide some fill-in data for our table. So here's our table, and I have these checkboxes up here so I can add some of the different CSS classes that allow us to add and tune the behavior. So here is just an ordinary table with no CSS class on it. I add the table element, and it centers the caption above it. It organizes things into nice, neat rows. It's a little subtle to see, but with striped, we get some standard zebra striping. That shows up pretty good up there. Bordered. Now it's drawing a nice thin border around the table, and it's curved at the edges. It's very nice. If we want to have element, the current row highlighted, we get that with table hover. And if we're trying to make it shrink up, take up a little less space, we can make it condensed. And of course, we can use whatever combinations of these we want. So again, just by adding a little bit of CSS, extending the CSS, the class tag in your elements, you get all of these new behaviors. Okay, one of the things I really like is the way they do buttons in Bootstrap, because I can't tell you how many times, on Tapestry, people are like, oh, I have a form, but I want it to look like a link when you submit it, or vice versa. I have a link that I want to make it look like the submit button on the form. With Bootstrap, you can make them look the same, whether it's a button tag, an input type equals submit tag, or just a standard A tag. You can apply the BTN, the button CSS class name to it, and it looks like a button. And then on top of that, you have all these additional values you can put on. So you can say it's the big primary button, and it has that nice white on blue look. And info, success, warning, danger, and then the odd inverse one. All of these CSS class names work, again, with A tags, button tags, input tags, so everything ends up looking nice and consistent. And then, again, with the theme that you take the basic class and extend it a little, you can then further say, I want this to be a large button or a little tiny mini button. So I tend to have large buttons affect everything on the page, and mini buttons affect maybe one item within a list. And again, don't have to get bogged down with exact sizes and so forth. It's very nice. Another nice feature of Bootstrap is that it comes with this set of images called glyph icons. And these are added to elements. They show up as a I tag with a special class name. And these all come down as one big image, a sprite sheet image. So it comes down very efficiently. So a lot of your very common operations, there'll be a nice icon you can put on it. So here's an example. We're building a button, and it's a dangerous button. So we put on the button danger tag, and it shows up as white on red. And then to get that icon symbol, the little warning symbol, we just say i.iconWarning. So it's a I tag, normally italic tag, but this icon-warning sign brings in that image and spaces it incorrectly. And since we are doing white text on a relatively dark background, we add .iconWhite to use the white on the white colored version of the image rather than the black image. And then additional text, do not press, and now we have a nice little button. Another big part of Bootstrap is forms. I'll go to the demo for this. There we go. So there's a lot of effort in the CSS for Bootstrap to make your forms look nice. Now, one aspect of it is, and they make a big case of this in their documentation, that from a UI perspective, having your labels stack with your elements is better for users. But they still provide you with the option to do it the other way. So this is an ordinary form, and this is a horizontal form. And just by adding that one CSS class to the form element, a whole bunch of stuff happens. The labels lay out differently, the tags lay out differently, even this, what's called the form actions here, where we can put our main buttons, those get indented correctly. So we can switch back and forth. And I put some simple validation in here. So for instance, if I try and submit the form and I haven't typed something that looks like an ordinary email address, we update, we add an error CSS class name to an element. I'll show you that in a second. Everything turns red. And there's room to put some text underneath as an error message or as help text. And it all still works horizontal or vertical layout. So forms, you break your form into what are called control groups. Each control group will have a label and then a nested control element. You put the actual controls inside there. So the controls are your input tags, your select tags, your text area tags. And one of the neat things, I don't want to get too bogged down in all the variations on forms because there's a lot of stuff here in Bootstrap for it. You notice that my email tag, my email field, had this little envelope icon added to the front of it. And you do that by putting a input prepend tag around the control, and then a span.addon, and then what you want to put in that little box at the beginning. And here I'm using text, but you can actually even have buttons or other things in that little tacked on area at the front. And there's a second one for the back. Okay, so I really like that. I kind of like the fact that you can decorate your fields easily to indicate what kind of data is going in there. And another aspect of this is you can put a help block inside your controls div, and that becomes help text that gets formatted. But again, if you end up making the control group error, putting the CSS error class name on the control group, that turns red with the field. There's a bunch of minor things I won't go into quite as much detail for, like there's some nice support for pagination. And this, again, is part of the Bootstrap idea. You put a div tag for pagination, and then use standard, pretty much semantic markup, a UL, a list with LI, list elements inside it. And it takes care of lining things up for you. There's also nice progress bar support. And the demo for this is kind of neat. It shows something a little subtle here. Let me make this full size again. Okay, watch carefully. You can see that I'm adding 10% to the progress bar about every second. And it's using a little bit of CSS3 animation to smoothly move the bar up each time that increments. Plus, again, you notice the color changes, and I do that by adding a little bit of another CSS class name to an element that controls the color. So my markup for that progress bar is a div with the progress element, progress class name in it. And because I wanted that cool little stripey animation, I add progress-striped. And I add .active to it, which causes the animation of the stripes moving. Then I have a little bit of page initialization. Here's that coffee script I was talking about, where every approximately second, I add 10% to the width. And when I see that we've hit 60%, I add bar-warning to the bar element, and that makes it turn yellow. And when I hit 90%, I change that to bar danger, and it turns red. So I was kind of pleasantly pleased to see that nice, the smooth animation when the value changes. Other common things that you see in pages are these labels and badges. So, labels may accompany a short note to the user, and badges, you see those, for instance, in like mail programs to indicate how many messages are in a mailbox. And again, same thing. It's a span or a div tag with a particular class name, and then you can add additional modifiers to it to get it to look just the way you want. So those are most of the simple things built into Bootstrap, but the more interesting stuff are the components, which combine some markup with some JavaScript to give you a more interesting amount of behavior. So let's start with the tabbing element. Okay, so there's nice support for tabs. So here I have some pictures of Mo, Larry, and Curly. So the basic tabs have a little bit of highlighting when you move the cursor over them. And when you click them, sorry about that. When you click them, it changes the value. The basic element here has this nav tabs CSS class on it, but if we don't like that look, there's one called pills. So we still get a little bit of a look on top, mouse over effect, and this is a different style. We can stack the values on top of each other. So if we want to have this kind of full width value for them and have the change below, we can do that. We can also move the tabs to the left, but that works with tabs, not pills. So here we can have the tabs on the left or on the right. So as I'm clicking these things, all my code is doing is changing the CSS classes. We're not drawing the whole page, and yet the Bootstrap CSS is doing a good job of making things update right in place. Setting this up is pretty easy. It's in two parts. One is the tabs themselves, and the other is the tab content. So you put the tabs in a UL element with the nav CSS class and the nav tab CSS class. And then you have LIs, list items, for each clickable element. And you mark one of those as active, and it gets slightly different CSS to show that it is the currently clicked one. And inside that, all you need is an A tag, a link tag, identifying the view element to display, and the special data toggle equals tab. That's an HTML5 data attribute. What Bootstrap does is it puts on the body element a handler for a click on any element where data toggle equals tag. So you have one event handler that's sort of there passively. And when you click on the element, it bubbles up to the body, gets handled by Bootstrap, and it does the work to update the CSS classes of which element is active and which tab content pane is active. So you sort of have this passive CSS doing the work for you. The other part is the tab content div with a tab pane for each element. And you can see how we're linking the href of the links to the ID of each tab pane. And to get one to display initially, we have to mark one of each as active. So we have the Mo link is active and the Mo tab pane is active. Okay. We can do the same thing dynamically. Okay, that's tabs and dynamic tabs. We can do the same thing dynamically. And here I added a little bit of a little fade in, fade out transition for them. So in this example, we start with an empty skeleton for the UL element and the tab content, and then we use a little bit of jQuery to populate both the UL element and the tab content, one for Mo, one for Larry, one for Curly. So we're using a little bit of CoffeeScript, a little bit of underscore, and we're generating the content on the fly. And the tricky part was this business with the UID. We have to come up with a unique ID to tie the tab element to the view pane. And we're using some of CoffeeScript's cool substitution and multi-line strings to build up that content inside the browser and plug it into the elements. And the last part was simply a matter of adding the fade CSS class to the tab pane. Just by adding that one thing, we get that cross-fading behavior where one image fades out and the other image fades in. Okay, another nice part of Bootstrap is to get rid of window.alert. Boy, is that abused in so many applications, and Bootstrap gives you a very simple, very easy replacement for it. So here we click the button, and this modal dialog comes in, and then we can click the button, and it sets up an alert to tell us that we did in fact click the button. And what's nice is, again, a little bit of animation goes a long way here. Here's the button, a little bit of highlight effect when I move the cursor over it. I click the button, and you see the background fades out. This thing rolls down from the top. And then when I dismiss the element, it shoots back up, and the screen comes back, and we've added the alert. So putting this together is, again, same thing, just a matter of assembling a little bit of elements with the right class names. And in this case, we have the modal dialog is a div with the modal tag, and we give it a unique ID. And then the button that triggers the modal dialog uses a special HTML5 data attribute, data-toggle equals modal. Same thing. You click that link, that click event bubbles up to the top, and a top-level handler provided by the Bootstrap JS says, oh, okay, I will go activate the modal dialog with that ID. And that JavaScript ends up being the stuff that fades out the screen and rolls down the display. And then the buttons in the modal dialog have another tag, data dismiss equals modal, that does the opposite. You click that, and that click event causes the animation that makes the modal dialog disappear and the fade background go away. It's also very common to create the modal dialog on the fly. And so there's APIs that you can use, jQuery plugins called modal that you can use to handle creating the modal dialog and getting it displayed on the fly rather than having it pre-rendered into your page. Here's an example, when you click the button, I had it update the page and put that little alert tag in. Here's some code for that. I wait for you to click on that particular button, and when you do, I create a little bit of markup, so it's a div tag with the alert CSS class plus fade plus in. So alert is most of that look and feel. Fade and in causes it to fade into view. If you remove the in tag, it would fade out. And inside that, we have a close button and some text, and it takes care of the rest. And because of that fade, this might be a little hard to see, but when I click here to dismiss this, it's very quick, but it doesn't just disappear, it fades out as it goes. So there's a lot of nice little touches along those lines. Okay. Another big piece is drop-downs. There's a drop-down in the application, in this border here that I've been using pretty consistently, and I have a drop-down example here. So, this is a typical little menu. Here I'm making use of glyph icons, and when I click one of these, it's creating an alert identifying what it is I clicked. So this is a bit longer, and once again, the same pattern. CSS class name, in this case, it's an LI, a list element called drop with the drop-down CSS class. And then within that there's the text for the drop-down button, the little chevron that you click that causes the menu to appear. Data toggle equals drop-down. That is what links up to the Bootstrap jQuery plugin to do the work of making the menu visible. And then below that, you have a UL drop-down menu that has LIs for each element. So I have one version that's the simple version that's just text. The second version next to it has text with icons. And I feel I'm getting a whole lot of menu for very easy. And then the last trick is when you click on one of those elements, I create an alert that identifies which one you selected. And there's a bunch of other built-in plugins. There's a nice one that, given how fast I've raced through this, I wish I had highlighted more, called Popover. That makes it very easy when you click or tab into a text to create a popover window that provides help or other details about what you're clicking in. Scroll Spy is nice for any kind of navigation menu because it sees where you've scrolled to on the page and updates your menu to highlight the corresponding element. You can see an example of that in the Bootstrap homepage. Where as you scroll down the page, the navigation on the right side, on the left side, updates to show what section you're in. There's also collapse, which you use for expanding and collapsing regions. There's a image carousel. There's a type ahead. There's little tooltips. All these follow that same pattern, though. Just a little bit of markup, the right CSS class name, the right data attribute, and Bootstrap tends to do the rest. One of the great things about Bootstrap is how easy it is to customize it. In fact, you can do a lot of your customizations right from Bootstrap's homepage. There's a form on the Customize tab, and if you go there, you can specify overrides of all of its basic behavior, everything from how many elements are in the grid to its basic width, all of these color details, fonts, stuff like that. So there's all this room where you can change the default values for all these variables. And it has a little Heroku app that brews up a customized version of the Bootstrap zip file, and that's what you get. So you have the option to do it that way. Or you can take Bootstrap's source code, these .less files, and use the less tool with your own customizations and have that as part of your build process. Now, one of the concerns people have had with Bootstrap is that, hey, everybody's site is going to look exactly the same. And there are several different sites that are already building on Bootstrap, providing customized versions of Bootstrap that provide different themes and looks and so forth. So one of these is called Wrap Bootstrap. And then there's Bootswatch. There it is, saving the web from default Bootstrap. Okay, that's pretty cool. One of the things you can do on Bootswatch is you have a little drop down where you can choose different themes. So here's one they call Amelia, Cyborg, United. If you didn't know about Bootstrap and you went to one site that had Amelia and one site that had Cyborg and one site that had United, you probably would think they maybe copied a couple of ideas from each other. You wouldn't believe that they're all the exact same markup. But they are with just slightly different CSS care of all the customization in Bootstrap. Okay, so this is a all too rapid preview of Bootstrap. Its big pluses, it's got some really sharp look and feel right out of the box, but it's still very customizable. It's only been around for a little over a year. I can't even remember how I found out about it. That's what happens when you read a lot of Twitter feeds. But very customizable, very active development. They've been cranking out release after release every month or so. Comes with a lot of good JavaScript, jQuery plugins that give you either a lot of nice default behavior or, and in their documentation, you see how you can customize that behavior to get something very specific. And my examples use CoffeeScript, but as I said, when you download the slide deck, you can see the full JavaScript versions. And I have these examples are up on GitHub as a project that runs using Node. So I'm Howard Lewis Shipp, and I do consulting in Tapestry and Clojure and training and all sorts of different things. And we got a couple minutes for some Q&A. Yes. So the question was, there were some vertical pipes that showed up in some of the markup. And is that something that actually goes down to the browser?
No, I mean, do you actually put that in your text file and then it gets converted by the J converter to a div element or something, or is that just to show us?
This is the pipe element that you're seeing there is part of this Jade markup syntax. So yeah, it basically identifies that this text here, text only, is pure text, not an element that occurs inside the A dropdown. Okay, so the HTML version of that, you wouldn't see a vertical pipe. Okay. So the question was that Bootstrap has its concept of the grid. There we go. Bootstrap has the concept of the grid. There's also a fluid container and a fluid grid, but what do you deal, how do you do true responsive layout? And in fact, Bootstrap ships with an optional CSS file called bootstrap-responsive. And there are special CSS class names you can apply to your elements that say this one should either only appear or never appear based on various factors, such as what your available width and height is. And some of the other elements built into Bootstrap, like its support for a nav bar, which I didn't really highlight, has the option of saying, okay, we'll lay out a bunch of buttons across the top, but if the screen shrinks too much, we'll take those buttons and collapse them into a drop-down list. And again, that's done declaratively, no extra interaction required. So the question is, the grids, are they vertical or horizontal? Can you do both? Yeah, I don't know that there's anything in Bootstrap to let you set the vertical height of elements. Almost everything is about its horizontal width. So, yes, on this grid, the rows tend to be pretty standard markup. They size based on the height of the actual content. But you constrain the width using the Bootstrap CSS classes. And you're looking very disappointed by that. So of course, the great thing about about HTML and JavaScript and CSS is how well everything fits together. So you could definitely imagine having extra CSS classes that you could merge in right next to the Bootstrap ones that say, I need this particular cell in the grid to be yay high. Okay, question?
I like CoffeeScript a lot, but it seems that one of the biggest complaints people have about considering using it is the issue with scoping of variable names inside functions versus the file scope. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Can you address whether that's been an issue for you?
So we're doing a side discussion about CoffeeScript. Now, although I did my examples in CoffeeScript, CoffeeScript is not something that is mandated by Bootstrap. I just chose to do my examples that way. And the Bootstrap JavaScript, jQuery plugins are in pure JavaScript. No CoffeeScript involved. So, but to your question, there's this issue in CoffeeScript where it's very smart about automatically providing a var whenever you first reference a variable name. But then if you have a more inner scope element that you use the same name, it actually ends up talking about the outer scope version of it. And I just haven't found that to be a problem. I suppose if you do have something inside your module that is at a high level, you want to give it a reasonable name, like not I, but maybe something that you're not likely to accidentally use at a deeper level. But a lot of the discussion about that I've seen on the list is really just straw man arguments against CoffeeScript by people who seem to be a little bit JavaScript zealot. We can talk more about that outside. Question? So the question was, I briefly touched on the fact that there's a tool called Less that is used by Bootstrap to generate the CSS. So Less is a sort of a macro language for CSS that allows you to express your CSS in a more natural manner, such as being able to nest elements and to have variables and expressions built into the Less CSS. And the way you would customize that is you would have a sort of top-level file where you would set values for various variables, like colors of things, fonts to use, size of the grid, those types of things. There are specific variable names documented with the Bootstrap that you could override. And then you would you would import the Bootstrap Less. And your definitions would override the built-in Bootstrap definitions, and the output CSS would reflect your customizations, and then you just use it. So Less was designed specifically to support that kind of behavior. There are similar systems out there in the Ruby world. There's Sass. And the Bootstrap people have some reason why they preferred to use Less. I think they didn't want to be tied to the Ruby platform because they tend to prefer doing everything in JavaScript. Does Bootstrap require HTML5? Yes, I believe it does. They're very clear in their documentation that there are aspects of Bootstrap that will not render correctly unless you have the HTML5 doc type. So the question is, can you use Bootstrap with a more semantic representation where you're not just using endless nested divs and span tags? And the answer is that if you look at the Bootstrap CSS, most of the rules specify the class name but not the element. I mean, for specific cases like input and label, you do have that. But in most cases, it doesn't care what the element is that you are attaching the CSS to, the class name to. So, the path of least resistance is to use div tags, but it really just is not going to care. So the question is Bootstrap popular with mobile development? And I actually don't know the answer to that. I believe, given that it has the nice responsive behavior built into it with the optional Bootstrap responsive CSS and a lot of the other features, then yeah, I can see that being nice for mobile. On the other hand, a lot of the more interesting interactions are based on jQuery. And some people don't want to use jQuery in mobile because it's a little heavy. And I don't know off the top of my head whether you can substitute in that, I'm pulling a blank on the name, that alternate version of jQuery for mobile. Zepto, thank you. I don't know if you can just plug in Zepto and get the same behavior.
There's actually a lot of significant overlap between Twitter Bootstrap and jQuery Mobile, so I'd probably use one or the other, but not both. But something like Twitter Bootstrap, if you wanted to do something like Backbone that doesn't have that mobile look and feel and all those things in there, that is a really sweet combination.
Okay, so what Scott pointed out is that you probably would choose jQuery Mobile or Bootstrap. You probably wouldn't use them together because there'd be so much overlap. It wouldn't be efficient, and they might end up duking it out a little bit. But if you're using, for instance, Backbone, which is not visual, and you can plug in Zepto, all of a sudden it starts being a really nice, nice combination. So the question was that in terms of customizing, that might be where you would plug in your semantic markup. And I'm not sure if that's accurate, because the CSS rules that are provided don't really care about the elements. So if you want to make up element names like, you know, user element and so forth, or use the semantic elements defined by HTML5, it really doesn't matter so much to Bootstrap what the element names are. It really just cares about the CSS class names attached to those elements. And then, if you, in the documentation, there are far more examples than I covered here. There's, you know, specific stylings for the address element, which is an HTML5 semantic element, and quite a few others. Oh, that's actually a really cool idea. So let me see if I can paraphrase that. The question is, could you create your own semantic CSS class names that you could attach to your elements that, through less, would bring in the Bootstrap rules, so that you could say, for instance, this is a